think we'll start. So hello, everybody, and welcome to this talk with author Rob Dunn, being interviewed by Gillian Blake. I'm Margaret Housk. I'm director of the Cornwall Library. So Rob Dunn is a Reynolds Professor of Applied Ecology at North Carolina State University and a Professor of Human Biodiversity in the Center for Evolutionary Hologenomics at the University of Copenhagen. And the book we're talking about tonight, he wrote with his wife, it's called Delicious. The subtitle is The Evolution of Flavor and How It Made Us Human. He has since published another book, A Natural History of the Future. We have, of course, both these books in the Cornwall Library. And Rob, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And Gillian Blake is Senior Vice President, Publisher, and Editor-in-Chief at Crown, a division of Penguin Random House, and she's also a member of the Cornwall Library Board. And Gillian, thank you very much for taking charge of this event. Are we all ready to go then? Everybody all set? Okay, great.
All set. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me to interview Rob. We haven't met before and I hadn't read the book until I was asked to do this. And let me hold it up again too, because it's actually just like a beautiful book and it's so interesting. And I'm going to start right out with a question that gets to right to the heart of the book. You describe in your introduction that the book is an exploration into the role of deliciousness in decisions our ancestors made. The idea is that food and flavor help shape evolution and human history. But then you also say, it's in the introduction, that it's actually based on what is a radical idea. And the radical idea is that humans and other animals actually prefer, when possible, to eat foods that are delicious. And in a way that seems totally obvious, every day I'm looking to eat something really yummy at my next meal, but it really hasn't been taken into account previously when people are thinking about human history and evolution. So tell us more about why this is such a radical idea.
Well, so in a way, it's not a radical idea because it's how we all think about our daily lives. You look at food, some looks more delicious, some things look more delicious than do other things, and you choose those. But somehow, very often, things that are obvious in our daily lives are totally inobvious to scientists. And this is one of those things where, on the one hand, scientists go to lunch, they go to dinner, anthropologists too, and they talk about food constantly, and they talk about the pleasure of food. And then they turn around and look at what they study, and all of those ideas sort of disappear. And so when we picture a crow choosing food in your backyard, or a chimp choosing food in nature, or we think about our ancestors, then all of our thinking about deliciousness disappears, and suddenly we're just thinking of those animals as sort of robots that are making optimal decisions. And so somehow there was this disconnect between sort of our daily perception of food and how scientists were thinking, and anthropologists too, about the rest of life. And so even though on the one hand it's not radical, it's radical relative to what people were doing in these fields. And so as an example, very often scientists will study, how does a bird go around and choose what food to eat? And there are hundreds, maybe thousands of these studies, and they focus entirely on how does the bird optimize the number of calories it gets. And nowhere in those studies is there any focus on, well, what tastes better to the bird and how does it actually choose? And when we started to look into it, what becomes clear is what is obvious to people when they're at their dinner table is that it matters to the bird if it tastes good. And what tastes good to the bird really depends on the details of the tongue of the bird, of the nose of the bird, of the mouth of the bird. And so it's sort of totally unsurprising and radical at the same time, which is why those both coexist in the intro.
So yeah, I'm going to jump ahead of out of the order that thought I was going to ask you some questions, but this goes right to, first of all, the book is about human taste, but it's also about animal taste. There's a ton about animal taste in here. And that idea of the bird, and when you put out the bird food, is it just because it's food, or is it because it's particularly delicious? And obviously, I think if you have, I'm a dog owner, not a cat owner. Like cats, I guess, are known to be finicky. I think my dog eats everything, although I have a little feeling like she likes peanut butter the best. But in the book, you do say that different animals taste a different world. Like you say that the hummingbird tastes a different world than a dog. And so is this all about the difference in their taste receptors?
Yeah, so the most obvious differences are taste receptors. And so that's the easiest thing to compare. And so we know, for example, that cats and all felids, and so jaguars, mountain lions, bobcats, they all lack sweet taste receptors. And so you can give them as much candy as you want, and it, in no way is it pleasing.
Like it just doesn't taste like anything different to them. They just don't
No,
taste the sweet.
I mean, there may be some other taste in the candy, but if it's really just sugar and some aroma, it's not pleasing at all. And so if you go from animal to animal, each animal has suddenly different taste receptors. And so that's a big part of it. But then if you think about flavor, flavor is taste plus things like mouthfeel, like what's the physical what's the texture and the sort of other physical characteristics of the food, and then aroma. And so all those things come together. And then if you're a cat, there's also some pleasure associated with a prey item that's moving. And so there's something visual, like oh,
that's so interesting.
And so when it sees the movement, that's somehow part of its concept of flavor, even though it wouldn't be to us. And so we can never totally know for any animal. I mean, even for other humans, we don't totally know what flavor is for any other individual. But if you start to think about, other animal species, we can get hints into what they're missing or what they have that we don't have. But each of them is different. And the bird feeder example is great because, I mean, everybody who's watched birds at a bird feeder has watched them take some seeds and throw other seeds away.
Right.
And so, and so that's why the seeds grow up under your bird feeder, is because those things taste bad to that bird.
Right.
And so it's there.
It's interesting that you say about these other senses that come into play, because there have been studies about humans tasting things differently when they are a different color, or if you can't smell while you're tasting. I did have COVID this year, and I lost my sense of taste was weird for a few days, but it was sort of there. I mean, I remember I got pistachio ice cream and I didn't taste the pistachio. I was like, oh. And then I couldn't smell for a few weeks, and it was such a weird experience. And I could taste, but it wasn't the same. So I had this, a little bit of an insight, and I think there are going to be a lot of studies are going to be done about smell and taste and COVID, because I think for so many people experienced what it was like to be deprived of those senses for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. And what we were able to see when we looked at humans versus other species in the book is that we're actually weird in the way our head is shaped. And so if you think about your dog has this long nose. And so when it smells, most of what it's smelling is really quite far from its mouth. And so it's sniffing the world and it's sniffing the ground. But our noses are really squished up. And as a result, when we smell, we feature the smells in our mouth much more than other species do. And also because we're standing up, we're not on the, with our nose pointed toward the ground.
Of course, that's sort of obvious. Yeah, of course we're not.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, most of us, I mean, it's unusual behavior, right? But as a result, our sense of flavor is really dominated by the sense of smell. And it's the smell molecules that are going from your tongue up into the back of your nose. It's called retronasal olfaction because it's a super beautiful thing, and scientists wanted a way to make it sound ugly. And so when you lose your sense of smell, you're losing all of those other notes other than just sweet, sour, bitter, umami, kokumi. And so all the dimensions of the food are really reduced. And it's the smell that's associated with memory. It's smell that's associated with sort of a good feeling that goes beyond just the simple pleasure. And so when you lose smell, you lose all of these other dimensions of the food. And it's hard for people to describe what's missing. I mean, it's like, just like your story, that something was wrong,
Yeah.
But I mean, how would you describe it?
Yeah, it's weird because and then some people lost both sense and taste, like fully didn't taste anything. I did taste, it just wasn't as delicious. So it was just less exciting. Anyway, dolphins, I thought this was interesting, have no taste, don't taste sweet, salty, umami. Do they taste anything? And
So
why
all the
would
ones-
they have evolved not to taste? What would be the reason for them to evolve not to taste, to not taste these flavors?
So they eat their food whole. So they grab it and swallow it. And so there's not this moment of chewing on it and deciding, do I want that or do I not want that? And evolutionarily, if things aren't used very often, they break very easily, because an individual that has a version that doesn't work is no more or less likely to survive. And so we have all kinds of broken genes in our body. And so the dolphin's genes for taste receptors just broke because they weren't helping it survive. But clearly the dolphin is still making choices about what to eat and what not to eat. And so there's some pleasure there, but we just have no way of even imagining what that is. You know,
Right.
what is that? Why do they keep eating? And why do they eat some things and not others? And so it's something else. Is it visual? Is it I mean, is their whole flavor world visual? And how do we think about that?
Right. Dolphins are fascinating and obviously so smart. So there's got to be something going on there. All right. I just want to go back a little bit to the sort of genesis of the book. You talk about how the book is you're weaving together, and a quote from the book again, what ecologists know about the needs of animals, what evolutionary biologists know about how our senses evolved, and what chefs know about the experience of food. So I have a two-part question on this. So you are an ecologist and an evolutionary biologist, and your wife and co-writer is an anthropologist. Can you talk a little bit about how your different areas of studies combined to contribute to the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think the earliest version of this is that, I mean, very often for me as a scientist, like writing a book is partially about, I've seen some world that I know most people don't get to see. It's like a special world I get access to by being a scientist. And for my wife, Monica, and I, it became clear many years ago now that when we would go visit groups of anthropologists or groups of scientists, we would invariably go to dinner. And we'd have these dinners where we'd sort of be at the interface of delicious things and conversation about food or beer or wine or cheese, and then what those people knew, their sort of secret knowledge about those things. And so for as much as scientists haven't written much about deliciousness and anthropologists haven't written much about it, that it's always at those dinner parties. It's always at the bar if you go out after. And so there was this kind of secret world that we just started gathering stories about. And because the lucky thing about our jobs, we get to travel around and do this.
You go to so many fabulous places. Like in the book, I'm telling you, constantly they're like off to Portugal and off to Spain and off to all these cool places. Later I want to hear about what was your favorite trip, but yeah, I'm jealous of your traveling life.
But so then there were a bunch of lenses that come out of this. And so on the evolutionary biology and ecology side, you know, some of the perspectives are about why an animal would make a particular choice or why a human would make a particular choice, and then how the senses associated with that evolved. On the anthropological side, it's about how do our ancient senses and our ecological interactions mesh with the complex reality that is human culture, that's shifting, that's moving all these different places. And so, for example, there's a chapter later in the book about French monks and cheese.
Yeah, I'm going to make you talk more about that. That's so interesting.
Yeah. And so I'll just say now that there are details of the rules of the monk's daily life and what they can eat and not eat that really shape what's available to them and what they can make delicious. And so there, the cultural rules set the stage for the kind of ecological interaction. And so we needed both of those lenses to sort of go back and forth. And then as we think about our own ancestors, there's also this period when mostly we study our ancestors from bones and tools. And then we fast forward to a period when suddenly we have, you know, prehistoric records and historic records, and we can kind of unite those two kinds of stories, and the anthropology comes in again there, but they're always both there.
Got it. And how did you make up for the fact that neither of you are chefs? Are you actually amateur chefs? Do you both cook a lot? Do either of you
We
cook a
like to
lot?
cook, but we also like to go to dinner with chefs, and which is super great. And when we started to go to dinner with chefs and to go to lunch with chefs, to talk with chefs, it became clear that chefs are the one group of people who think holistically about these ideas. They don't always have the words biologists would use or the words anthropologists would use, but in their daily work, the flavor is in the middle of things, and they look at the rest of the world through that lens. And so we were constantly trying to drag their perspective through these stories to think about, well, what would the chef think? And then we also would share chapters with them and sort of get feedback and think about, okay,
Cool.
what doesn't
And did
make
they
sense?
find it super interesting what you were doing? Did it sort of adjust their thoughts about what they were doing
Yeah,
as they cook?
I hope so. And the feedback we've seen so far is that it seems to have. And one recent example is a fun one, which is that I was just at a meeting with chefs talking about this book. And one of the chefs, I was talking about fruit. There's a chapter about fruit and how fruits evolved to attract animals to carry the seeds of the plant. And one of the chefs stood up and he said, with several expletives that I'll bleep here, do you mean bleep, 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 that fruits are bleep, bleep, chefs of nature, nature's chefs? And so it was this amazing moment for the chef in recognizing that nature in some ways is evolving to appeal to consumers. And this then triggered a whole bunch of conversations about, well, why did no fruits evolve to appeal to predators? And so that came back to me from the chefs, like, why isn't there, or scavengers, why isn't there a fruit that attracts vultures, for example? And I have no idea. And so then that sent me back to meet with my ecologist friends to think about, well, why might this be? Why don't we see things like that? And so there have been lots of follow-up conversations like that, where their response has been from such a different perspective that it causes me or causes Monica to have to rethink some of these things that in our fields we don't pay any attention to. And so that's been wonderful.
That's great. I love any dialogue across disciplines. I think it just enriches both. I thought that chapter about fruit was very interesting. And it's going to lead me into talking about this notion of extinction, because you do say that you think that fruit may have evolved to please animals that are now extinct. And you also say that flavor played a role in which species our ancestors chose to hunt, so therefore what animals possibly went extinct. So I think those are two sort of separate issues around extinction. So you can choose which one you want to talk about first. But when Margaret and I talked about the book, right when I was reading it, I said, how about these tasty mammoth feet? How weird is that?
Well, let's start there because it has a Connecticut version. So there would have been mammoths in Connecticut at different time points. And when the first humans came into the Americas, there were mammoths, there were mastodons, there were giant sloths, and there were multiple species of all of those. And we've known for a while that humans played a role in those extinctions, and huge debate about were humans the biggest part of that story or just part of that story. But there's been not very much discussion of, well, how did those people decide which things to hunt? And to the extent that there's discussion about it, it's that, you know, while they're trying to get as many calories as possible, it's all about calories.
Right.
But if you go and look at modern studies of peoples who depend on hunting for their survival, and you interview those people about how do you choose what to hunt, the few studies that have been done are very clear that they choose the tasty things, and they choose wild pigs, peccaries, warthogs, and they go a long way to get those. And then there's like some monkeys that are super common but taste terrible, and they don't eat those. And so if you look at modern hunters, taste, flavor, this whole experience is a really important part of what you run down and get. And so to imagine it wasn't true of our ancestors is sort of to imagine that they weren't human in some way, that they weren't like us.
Right.
And so in the book, what we do is to think about, well, what could we know about mammoths and mastodons and some of these species? Might they have been tasty? And we go through the evidence, but the take home is that by most accounts, they were probably delicious, and especially their feet. And we know that in part because their feet would have been a lot like elephant feet, and people who've eaten elephant feet love them. It's like pig knuckles, you know. And the super intriguing part about this is there are several archaeological sites where most of the mammoth or most of the mastodon is in one place, and then the feet are back in the cave where people were staying. Like you left most of the mammoth, but like you were hoarding the feet to eat them special later. And it's in the chapter we consider these ideas and how would you think about them? What do we know and not know? But really trying to bring a little bit of humanity back into these early people who are looking for food, and we imagine care about deliciousness and pleasure too.
Yeah, I mean, again, it makes total sense, but in any class or book I've read on this topic, this issue of deliciousness has certainly never come up before. So what about the fruit? The fruit could have evolved. This is talking about not human, predators, but the way fruit might have been evolved for animals that are now extinct.
Yeah, so if you look at a lot of the fruits that you find in the store in Cornwall or wherever, I mean, most of the big ones are very unusual. And that they think about a mango, think about an avocado. Avocado is actually a great example. So an avocado's got that giant seed on the inside. And so whatever is going to disperse that seed has to be big enough to swallow that seed without killing it. And so why does the avocado exist? What did it evolve to attract? And so what Dan Jansen argued almost 45 years ago now is that many of these big fruits actually evolved to attract those extinct megafauna, mammoths, mastodon, giant sloths, and the like. And they're big because those animals would only go after fruits that were that big, and those animals were great dispersers because they would then walk a long way and deposit the seed. And so this is the story we tell there. And one interesting part of this story is that there are many of these fruits. Squash is in this category. I mean, go to I'm not going to think of good examples now, but pears, even apples to some extent. Who ate those in nature, and it was big species. But if you look out into the Amazon, if you look out into parts of tropical Asia at these big fruited things, some of them are becoming very, very rare and maybe even going extinct, and some aren't. And so what's happened with these fruits since the megafauna went extinct? And what we argue in the book, and here really echoing what other people have already said, is that there's a subset of these fruits that by happenstance are super tasty to us. And those have survived because we've spread them, because we like them, because we eat them and throw them out and disperse them. And so we've in a way killed off the megafauna and then replaced some of their roles. And so every time you bite into that delicious avocado, you're engaging in this really ancient story of extinction and loss and new relationships that I think is interesting.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I mean, I know everyone is going to eat their next meal and think differently about everything they eat. Okay, we've got to go back. This one's coming. We had a little pre-meeting and I warned him about one particular question I was going to ask. If we go back to that conversation about the mammoth feet and all of that eating of chewing on meat, I'm horrified because I am a vegetarian, and I've been a vegetarian for a really long time, much to the horror of my parents, who were, meat and potato loving wasps. They did not understand. And it was not because I was a young environmentalist or, loved animals so much. It was actually all about what I now know, having read this book, is mouthfeel, which Rob mentioned earlier. But so I just, at about 8 or 9, said to my parents, I just didn't want to chew flesh. And I am obviously not a child anymore, and they really thought I was going to grow out of it, but I never did. And so I want you to tell me why. Why is this thing so important to me? Also, I don't eat mushrooms because I think they're really fleshy. And I really am not picky about I eat almost everything else, but it is so hardwired. And you talk a little bit about what's hardwired and what's not. Anyway, I don't know if you have had any thoughts since I mentioned this the other day.
Well, so mouthfeel, for context, is the physical feel of food in your mouth. It's its squishiness. It's how it feels to tear. And, you know, if you think about what your hands do and you run your hands over something, I think we're very comfortable with the idea that some things are pleasing, some things are not pleasing. But for whatever reason, when it goes into the mouth, that scientists haven't studied very much the realities of mouthfeel. It's been a kind of neglected sense. Even though if you talk to people about the pleasure of eating, it comes up all the time. And so clearly it's really important, but I think it just sounds weird and it's a little unusual to talk about. And yet it's clearly very important. And so chefs, this is one where chefs talk about mouthfeel constantly. And it makes it awkward to have a meeting with a chef and a non-chef, because invariably you get to the point in the dinner when the chef starts talking about mouthfeel and you have to explain it's a real thing. But it clearly plays a role in what we decide to eat and what we don't decide to eat. And one of the interesting things we noted is that fruits have very different mouthfeels. And so think about an avocado. It's really smooth and fatty. And an avocado has very little aroma. People describe it as green, and it doesn't have much taste. And so, but think about the experience of an avocado. It's very pleasurable. But what is it? It's almost exclusively the mouthfeel. And so here's a fruit that we mostly eat for its feel, even though we don't talk about that as part of flavor. And so that's interesting on its own. But the other part is, why does it have such a pleasurable mouthfeel? Why did that evolve? And one possibility is that it evolved not only to attract mastodons or giant sloths, but also predators. And that some predators may have a predilection for this smooth, soft mouthfeel. And who knows, you know, we speculate a little bit about it in the book. It's written about in one paper by an ecologist, but it is an interesting mystery. And if you think about it, there aren't many other fruits that have that same kind of feel. And so why is it there? And so it's something about that some animals like that feel and some don't. And we know nothing, to go back to your original story, Gillian, like, why do different people prefer different mouthfeels? Like, I don't like the mouthfeel of apples. Like a crunchy apple, it's got that little bit of, I don't even want to talk about it. I don't really like it. And I know if I sit around a group of people, that's a weird response to it, but I don't know why that is. And we really are seeing a mouthfeel that we don't even know what sensors to look at. You know, we don't know where we should focus to understand it, but it's fascinating. And maybe if people could share in the chat foods with mouthfeels they do or don't like, it would be interesting.
Oh, that's a good idea. I'm very pleased that I had avocado toast for breakfast this morning, and I had an apple as a snack this afternoon. So I'm really in tune with what you're talking about right now with these two fruits. And I like both, but my husband thinks avocado is slimy and disgusting. So there you go. It's very, you know, different people have these different predilections. But you also talk about mouthfeel and cooking, and then cooking this idea of fire, right, is this whole other story, and this notion that the labor involved in, you know, that humans are willing to put a lot of labor into their food is also part of the story. But maybe let's just talk about fire and cooking first.
Yeah, so it's been debated for a long time. When do humans first begin to use fire and why? And it's one of these things that paleoanthropologists argue about nonstop. I mean, it's like a constant argument. You can dip your toe into it whenever you want, and you'll still be in that argument. But what we found when we were talking to people about the book is that what they seemed to agree about was that whenever it happened, and whatever its sort of bigger causes, that the immediate reason anybody would eat cooked food versus raw food is that the cooked food tastes better. And especially, I mean, so it has, if you think about cooked meat versus cooked beef versus raw beef. The cooked beef has all of the aromas from the Maillard reaction, but also its mouthfeel is much better. It's not as chewy.
I mean, I wouldn't know, obviously, but
yeah. Well, or think about chew.
I know, I get it. I get it.
Root. So think about a raw potato
Yeah.
versus a cooked potato.
Worlds
the same
of
sort of
difference.
thing. And so what's transformed by fire is aroma, but also mouthfeel. But the other thing that happens there is that if you think about a chimpanzee spends 70% of its day chewing. And
Oh
if
my
a chimp
God,
had fire,
that's amazing.
suddenly it would be able to eat these foods much more quickly. It would enjoy a different feeling of the food. And so the whole culinary experience transitions in that moment in which fire is invented. And I have a colleague, Ainara Sistiaga, who I met through this book. And she's been working on early humans in East Africa. And she's found sites where she thinks that the early humans were taking meat to hot springs and actually boiling the meat in hot springs. That she finds evidence of the weird chemicals from the hot springs on the meat that was being eaten by these early people. And so you can imagine this is why do you do that? Surely part of that is about mouthfeel, about pleasure, about aroma.
We just had a question in the chat about this that I thought is, Susan says, isn't cooked food about making calories more available more easily rather than mouthfeel? Well, it's definitely not just about mouthfeel, but what's the role of the calories?
Yeah, so it's both. That's a great question, Susan. So, I mean, we can think about both what cooking does for a species and why an individual might cook. And so in our thinking, when the individual goes to cook, that what they're often thinking about is things that are more about flavor, mouthfeel, aroma. But in terms of the benefits to a species of cooking, that at the same time, you're getting the added benefit of more calories. Most of the time, it's not always true with cooking. And so these seem like two ways of looking at the same question. If you're thinking about how do you get enough calories to be able to have a big brain that sets the stage for all of the rest that is humanity, then clearly those calories are important to that story. But if you're thinking about, well, why is this individual making this choice? The early humans didn't have a calorie counter. They couldn't do a budget of what this was doing for them. But in a way, flavor was guiding them toward a choice that yielded more calories. And so these things to go hand in hand. And what we're doing here is just a little bit changing the perspective to say, this looks a little bit different if we include flavor in our perspective on this story. But Susan, you're absolutely right.
Interesting. So, okay, you talk about cooking, obviously, fire in the book, but you talk a lot about fermentation as well. And I found all of that really interesting. And I think you even say that chimpanzees have the ability to ferment fruit, or do they have the ability, or do they actually do it?
So there's a capuchin monkey, with the little white head, the organ grinder monkey. And there's one population that so far has been documented. Liz Mallett, an anthropologist, would go out and study these capuchin monkeys. And she found they kept going up this one tree and they would knock all these big fruits down that they were too big for the capuchin monkeys to eat, and they couldn't bite into them. And they would spend tons of time doing this, and the ground would be covered with fruits, and then they would leave. And what she saw the first time is that 3 weeks later, they came back and these fruits were all rotten and they'd become like little fruit kombuchas. And the monkeys grabbed them off the ground and they ate them. And so the first time she saw this, it was surprising. And then she saw it a second time, and then she saw it a third time. And now it looks pretty clear that the monkeys are actually controlling the process of fermentation. They're not adding yeast, that they don't have a vat. But on some level, they've learned that if they carry out this behavior, the fruits become edible. And so to me, it's a pretty remarkable story, because if those monkeys are doing that, well, how much else are we missing about how other species are controlling fermentation? And writing the book, we found all these great anecdotes from field biologists. And so, for example, it's known that some hyena species that live by the ocean will take their prey and drag it into the ocean when it's dead and then pull it back on shore. And so it looks like they're salting their prey.
Oh my gosh, I love it. That's amazing.
And so there are all these anecdotes like this, but we've not thought about them in the context of fermentation, much less flavor. But it looks like wild animals are doing more than we think, which I think is a common story over the last 50 years, that we tend to think of ourselves as uniquely clever, but then look around and find that the rest of life is getting by too.
I love that these little monkeys are kombucha makers. It's amazing. So fermentation, just in general, is you talk about it as foods that rot the wrong way are dangerous, bad. Foods that rot the right way can be delicious. And you talk about the connection to the sour taste in fermentation. And so like the difference between bitter and sour, but how that sour taste has kind of led to our using fermentation, or vice versa. I'm not sure which.
Yeah. So when we started this book, I mean, there are a bunch of gaps in the literature that we found when writing the book, and sometimes they're fun because you get to write across the gaps, and sometimes they're just gaps, and so they have to study things. And so sour was one of those gaps we had to then go study. And we found that no scientist, anthropologist, whatever, had ever looked at the evolution of sour taste, not a single paper ever. And so there were basically no explanations of why we even have sour taste. And so we've spent a long time thinking about this, but what those showed us, among other things, is that the fondness that humans have for sour things is really weird, that the vast majority of animals taste sour, but they don't like it. And so what we started to wonder in the book is what if one of the roles of sour taste is to tell us when something that fermented is rotted safely. And the way this might work is that there are only two kinds of bacteria that produce acid: lactic acid bacteria, which you have in yogurt, they're in kimchi, they're in, they're in sourdough bread, or vinegar bacteria. And both of those kinds of bacteria. Those are the
only two.
Yeah, for the most part.
Wow,
and so the
interesting.
Vinegar bacteria produce acetic acid, and lactic acid bacteria produce lactic acid. And most other species also can't tolerate acid. And so that acid is a defense produced by those bacteria. And so if they're present in a rotting thing, they tend to kill everything else off. And so if you find something that's rotting and it tastes acidic, the odds that it's safe are really quite high. And so it's a pretty useful kind of pH meter to let your tongue, guide you toward what's probably safe. And then the thing we found by talking to chefs about this is that the chef said that they can actually tell a good ferment from a bad ferment just by walking into the room and smelling it. From learning bad ferments because they made them sick, they have a really keen sense of smell for detecting things that are not safe. And so if you imagine the tongue and as a sort of an innate pH guide, and then aroma as a learned guide, helping you to ferment, maybe it's easier to do than we tend to imagine. And just to jump ahead a little bit, there's now reasonable evidence of early humans trying to ferment different things, and maybe quite early. And so there's a story we tell in the book of mastodons in Michigan that were found in lakes, and they appear to have been tethered to the bottom of the lake. And it's now thought that they were tethered there. Dan Fisher at University of Michigan has argued this, to store them and ferment them over winter. So if you killed a mastodon, you could keep eating it. And like a good anthropologist, he went back and he repeated this with a dead horse. And then he tried it month after month. And even after 5 months, he said it smelled like a blue cheese and had a delicious steak-like taste. And so this is not to say that we know for sure mastodons were fermented, but that instead it's useful to think back and give a little bit more creativity in a culinary perspective to our ancestors and think about what they might have been doing.
the reason to ferment is also to preserve, right? Is
Yeah,
to be able
right.
to eat something. So do you think that, because it is strange that we like some of, or I find it strange, go back to kombucha. Like I drink it, I was like, do I like this or not? I'm not sure, but or kimchi, or many of these things that are fermented. I mean, even you talk a lot about alcohol in the book, right? But is it, and then alcohol is another added, euphoric benefit. But do we like the taste because we have to like the taste because this was a way to get through the winter, et cetera?
I think our argument in the book is that it's a mix, that to some extent we're learning to like these things, given what we have available and given context. And we know that learning happens in utero. And so a fetus in the womb is already picking up smell molecules from its mother's diet. And so when the baby is born, any smell molecules it picked up from its mother's diet, if it picked them up with some frequency, it likes those smells. And so studies have been done that mothers that eat fermented fish, their newborn babies like the smell of fermented fish. Anise, their newborn babies like the smell of anise. The same for garlic, the same for some vegetables. And so you can imagine that even for really stinky fermented foods, that preference can be passed down really early. And if you imagine our ancestors moving over hills, trying new things, this is a really important way to teach even before you could speak. And so in that context, distinguishing what's learned and what's innate, it becomes tricky. It's part of us. It's part of how we come to the world.
Right. That makes sense. Okay. So some questions are starting to come in. I'm going to ask you another one or two more questions that I really want to talk about. But people, please start putting in some questions into the chat so we can move to them afterwards. Let's get back to cheese and the Benedictine monks, because again, cheese is something, sometimes you say blue cheese or some of these really stinky cheeses. I love stinky cheese. And it's so bizarre, right? That it can smell so bad and then still taste so good. But also it's back to this idea of the labor, that the labor humans, I just think this is such an interesting idea that humans really are willing to put a lot of labor in to get delicious food out. But you tell the whole story about these monks, and I think it's worth relating here.
Yeah. So the Benedictine monks decided they wouldn't eat meat, especially from four-footed animals, and depending on your interpretation, also chickens, but they could use dairy. And they had plenty of time to dedicate to food, and sort of monkish time, dedicated time of doing a thing well, was also holy time. And so what you see in these monasteries again and again is that the monks find ways to make stinkier and stinkier cheeses, and to favor those cheeses, and to find extraordinarily elaborate ways to produce them. And many of those cheeses often take on aromas that are described as bodily or animal. And so there's an argument to be made that they're actually finding these bodily smells made out of milk through these complex fermentations. That if the ferment, and to make a simple dry cheese, not that hard. To make these monkey cheeses like an Laplace is super hard and super laborious, and it goes wrong all the time. And so something about their context creates this desire for this more complex food that they're creating, that then appeals to their senses, and that even though it's stinky, that many of us come to love too. And so what's happening there? And we talk about this at some length. And then the other really unusual thing in this context is that monks in Japan, some Japanese monks, also vegetarians, figured out how to ferment tofu. And in doing so, produce some tofus that have some of the exact same smell molecules as some of the stinkiest French cheeses. And so something really fascinating is going on there. And those are some of the same molecules that are in, I never say it right, asafoetida, the spice that's used by Jainsians in India, who are uber vegetarians. And so there's something in the vegetarian world of monkish behavior that leads people toward these kinds of aromas. And then the other amazing thing is that a lot of the microbes on these cheeses are body microbes. And so in some real way, as the monks are making these cheeses, they're also giving them a kind of embodiment that if not quite human, is really in some very specific way animal. And so there's a Brevibacterium linens, which is a common orange bacteria you'll see on the rinds of some cheeses. And that's a body bacteria. It's found on human bodies and cheeses.
Wow.
And so how do we think about that? And we don't answer these questions. I mean, these are bigger questions, but to us, they're fascinating and
Do you think
delicious.
it appeals to us? I mean, it must appeal to us, right? That we know like how hard it was to make that cheese, like the, aged wine or anything that sort of, we have a sense of its value of, and how hard it is to recreate.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something about the sublime that in the same way that there's some emotion attached to looking at the universe that is more than its simple beauty, that the grandeur matters. And there's a kind of grandeur in some of these foods, and what it takes to make them and the details that go into them that I think we appreciate partially through our senses and partially intellectually.
Yes.
But then there's that full richness of experience when you're around a table in France and one of these cheeses come to you and it's the middle of the night and somebody's singing, and how do you measure all those things together? But it's extraordinary.
Right. That probably contributes to the longevity of some of these kinds of food, right? But that's not why the monk made it in the first place.
No, yeah.
And once it becomes part of this tradition and the story of the region, and then it's kind of just continues, right? Because it's part of why people come to visit that area, and it becomes part of the culture.
Yeah.
All right, so Shari asks a question. Speaking of flavor and health, does the fact that some cultures cook with intensely hot peppers affect the evolution of their health as opposed to those who don't?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry. So there's an argument to be made. So spicy peppers are tricky. Why do we like them? Oh, and there's a question about color. I see that, Phyllis. We'll come back to that. And one of the arguments about peppers is they're about a kind of benign masochism. It's like going to a scary movie, that you eat a spicy pepper, it feels dangerous, but your consciousness allows you to know that you're not going to die. And so there's a kind of thrill, a little bit of euphoria, but the end of the story, which clearly is part of what's going on. The other possibility is we know that the capsaicin in chilies can kill some foodborne pathogens. And so it's been argued that in places and times when food got left out, often when there wasn't refrigeration, that being able to spice it with chili peppers, with garlic, with other antimicrobial spices would have helped to reduce the risk that food would kill you. And so I think if you have a refrigerator, and cooking with intensely hot peppers today might not have matter to health so much, but if you don't have a refrigerator, it may matter a lot. I don't know if that answers your question. Sorry.
No, I think that's very interesting. And how about this? What role does color play in all this?
So we didn't pay much attention to color in the book, and afterwards, this is one of the things that the chefs have all said we were fools for. Because two things. One thing is the chefs say, like, the color matters so much. How could you not pay attention to color? Look at the fruits; they're different colors. It matters. And so there's another book to be written about color, but one indication that it matters a lot is that fruits that are dispersed by different animals have different colors. And so depending what you want to attract, you make your fruit a different color. And so bird berries are often red. And so that's why red berries are often toxic, because they evolved to be attractive to birds, not to mammals. They actually would rather kill mammals. And so color clearly plays a role in nature. And so it must also in our own human story, but we didn't pay much attention to it. And
I want to say that that's okay as an editor, because the book is not about color. It is about flavor. Like, that was your particular. So yes, maybe the next one, but I think it's okay that you didn't talk about it in this one.
Thank you, Gillian.
And Shari's asking about lime. Is it also an antimicrobial? And is that why it's squeezed on raw fish or ceviche?
Yeah, I mean, it's also a little bit antimicrobial. The acid is antimicrobial, and maybe some other features of the lime, and for sure it helps. But raw fish is also pretty good at hiding pathogens inside itself, and so it's, it's not foolproof. Yes, so don't buy week-old fish in Cornwall and squirt it with lime and hope all will be okay.
Good tip. All right, I have a couple more questions, but anyone who still is thinking about asking one, pop it in now. The last chapter has a very cool title, Dinner Makes Us Human. Can you explain why?
Well, for us, this book really started around dinners. It started around conversations about food that were interesting to Monica and to me, but also in some really deep, some really human way, deeply pleasurable, in a way that we've all missed during COVID. Being around a table, enjoying the pleasure of food, talking, having that pleasure of food rarefied by good ideas and bad ideas. That something about that is very special, and it has antecedents in other species, but the way we do it is so human. And so the last chapter is really about what do we know about coming together and what it offers us. And what we know from the animal world is that when chimps share food with each other, they get a dose of the same hormone that mothers get when they hold their babies. And so there's some really important hormonal communication going on around sharing food, even in chimps. And so we imagine that when we share food together in a big group, that we're experiencing some of those same very bodily connections that rise to the level of hormones, but that are also embedded in all the other things that are happening around us. And in a way that a book like this is never going to fully capture. And yet is somehow the amazing beauty of what we can do together. And for us also a metaphor of what we hope for in sort of the next stages of thinking about flavor and thinking about lots of things, which is the idea that by being together with different ideas around a common table, that we see much more clearly than we ever see on our own. And so the table also offers us that, I think. And maybe this is apropos of the Thanksgiving and also the real world reality that we can gather around a table and not like each other too. But
well, you were saying that, and it is really interesting that we're talking about this right before Thanksgiving, right? Because everybody, loves their family, and also, after Thanksgiving complains a lot about their family. But chimps share some food, but they don't talk to each other, right? And I think you said in that last chapter that they will not sit down with strangers to strange chimps, like chimp. And I guess that in general, but that we're kind of unique, and that you and I was going to ask at the very end about some of your favorite trips and favorite dinners in researching the book, but you talk about how you sat down with strangers all the time to eat, and that is a very uniquely human practice.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. And for us, it was some of our greatest joys in our lives have been about welcoming strangers or being welcomed as strangers. And one example of one of those meals is we just met a group of people in Catalonia in Spain, or in Catalonia, depending on your politics. And we were invited to a Saturday meal in the first floor of a house from the 1400s that was being rebuilt, but it had nothing but a table. And so we sat at this table with strangers and we ate and talked for 4 hours. And the generosity of that moment of being welcomed into that was just extraordinary. And that kind of thing the chimps can't do.
I love that. Phyllis says that's where the phrase companion comes from, companion with bread. I didn't know that. Very cool. Well, we are nearing the end of our time here. I do think that this was excellent that we did this at 5 o'clock, as we're all about to go prepare our meals and think about all of the ideas we talked about today. I certainly learned a ton reading the book and recommend it again. Let me hold it up again. Everybody order a copy, buy a copy, come to the library, get a copy. I'm excited to read your next book too, Rob. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with our community. Margaret, is there anything else that I
Thank
should be
you, Rob,
saying?
very much. And, you know, I'll just hold up Rob's newest book, A Natural History of the Future, which we also have in the library. Thank you very much, Rob. That was fascinating. And Gillian, thank you so much for exploring that book with us. Thanks
Thank
very
you so
much.
much. It was a great pleasure and great to meet you all.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Good night. Thanks for
Everyone.
joining us.